Honorable Senate, dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear celebrating audience. I have the pleasure to open the special session of the Senate of the Corvinus University of Budapest, convened for the purpose of conferring the title of Honorary Doctor and Professor on a distinguished recipient. It is my privilege to greet our guests and welcome the leaders of the university, members of the Senate, professors and students. First of all, I would like to extend my warmest greetings to Nobel laureate Professor James Heckman. Let me introduce the members of the Presidium. Professor Bruno von Potesberg, Rector of our university. Professor Zoltán Oskar Szánto, Dean of the Corvinus Institute for Advanced Studies. Professor Tamás Bartus, Vice Rector for Faculty and Research. Professor István Kónya, Dean of the Doctoral School, Corvinus Doctoral School, Professor Péter Csóka, Head of the Doctoral School of Economics, Business and Informatics. And I am Zoltán Balázs, Chairman of the University Doctoral Council. Most Honorable University Senate, dear guests, university education and scientific development cannot be imagined without a wide range of scientific cooperation and international academic relations. It is always a very special event in the life of our university to award our highest distinction, the title of Honorary Doctor and Professor. The Senate rewards this title those who pursue outstanding and internationally recognized scientific and public activity, and at the same time keep closely in touch with our alma mater. The Senate of the Corvinus University of Budapest, taking into account Professor James Heckman's professional and scientific activity, his outstanding international reputation, has decided to award the title of Doctor and Professor Honoris Causa to him. Now I request Professor Zoltán Oskar Szánto, Dean of the Corvinus Institute of Advanced Studies, to acquaint us with Professor Heckman's scientific work.
Respected Presidium, esteemed guests, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. James Joseph Heckman is a Nobel laureate in economics in 2000, and he is among the most influential economists in the world. He holds nearly a dozen honorary doctorates, including University College London, Wirtschaftsuniversität Vienna, Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's a professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Center for Economics of Human Development. His citations exceed 250,000. His Hirsch index is 180. An extract from his Nobel lecture in 2000 sums up his disciplinary background and research interests. He defined his discipline in the following way. Econometrics is a branch of economics that unites economic theory with statistical methods to interpret economic data and to design and evaluate social policies. He received his BA in mathematics from Colorado College in 1965 and his MA and PhD degrees in economics from Princeton University in 1968 and in 1971, respectively. He began his teaching career at Columbia University in 1970 and returned to his hometown, to Chicago, to University of Chicago in 1973, where he is still active today. He has taught, conducted research, and participated in a significant number of academic projects around the world. He is credited with the creation of the globally used Heckman correction method. His relationship with Corvinus University has begun in 2023, and in the years since then, he has led several joint online research seminars in the Family, Fertility, and Human Development Project, which he is directing, and dozens of internationally renowned researchers from around the world are participating. The joint research group looks at the causes and consequences of the decline in fertility rates worldwide, and what social policy practices can be effective in halting or even reversing these trends. As Professor Heckman himself puts it, while widely discussed in media and academic circles, analytically rigorous discussions often remained siloed within specific disciplines, applying field-specific approaches. There is, so far, no comprehensive synthesis and shifting of competing explanations. This work of global importance is what the Family, Household, and Economy Research Group within the Corvinus Institute for Advanced Studies and the Center for the Economics of Human Development, University of Chicago, are working on in the framework of a multi-year project, Family, Fertility, and Human Development, led by Professor Heckman. James Joseph Heckman's honorary doctorate is fully justified on the basis of his outstanding research career, and it is also important to take into account the fact that this joint research, which is of unquestionable global significance, will give Corvinus University of Budapest further international visibility that will bring extraordinary opportunities not only for the university, but also for the Hungarian academia. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for the laudation, Professor Santo. Now I turn to Professor Bruno von Pottesberg, Rector of the Corvinus University of Budapest, and request him to confer the title of Honorary Doctor and Professor on Professor Heckman. Would you please stand up for this important act?
We, on behalf of myself and the Senate of the Corvinus University of Budapest, are ready to confer the title of Doctorate Professor Honoris Causa of our university on you, Professor James Joseph Heckman, honoring your outstanding achievements in understanding the economic and social problems related to social mobility, skill formation, inequality, early childhood development, and regulation. Now, we endow you with all the rights and obligations which apply to honorary doctors and professors by force of law and habit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor von Pottesberg. I request the audience to be seated, and I also request the Presidium to be seated in the front row, because now we will listen to the inaugural lecture of Professor Heckman, which I request him to give us, in the title, Global Fertility Decline, Its Consequences, and Factors to Promote Fertility. Professor Heckman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the honor you've conferred on me. I deeply appreciate it. And I also look forward to working together here on this project that was just described on fertility and on world fertility patterns, and really understanding in a better way what the causes of this change in fertility and change in demographic status and change in values, if you want to include that, means for the world and how we might interpret it, and what, if anything, should be done about it. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity, because tomorrow we're having a conference, the next 2 days, and the conference will be made available, I think, will be made available to everybody, and it should be some world-class economists, sociologists, demographers coming to this conference, and they will, I think, illuminate what are basic problems in American and world society. So I think this should be a very fruitful conference. And today, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more of an introduction to what the conference is going to be about. Instead of my giving something different, I mean, I could talk about the influence of the Beatles on the world economy, but I won't. Today, I'll talk much more about fertility patterns in the world. And I want to describe what the issues are that we're going to be discussing tomorrow. And in some sense, I'm going to be stealing the thunder of a few of the speakers. But second, you can think of this as an advertisement, too, for what we're about to hear tomorrow. So I am deeply grateful for this opportunity to work with Corvinus University and for this whole group to be assembled here. So what I want to talk about today is looking at fertility decline around the world, not just in OECD Europe, but also in other countries, other parts of the world. And I want to understand, too, how we came to this. What are the factors that give rise to what is generally, not universally, a pattern of fertility decline? And I think what I want to understand is understanding a little bit of the history of this, going back to the Malthusian models of fertility decline, which more or less accurately describe the human race until about maybe 200, 250 years ago, and then show what it was that changed, and then what it is that changed again in thinking about fertility. So I want to be able to think about the different factors, economic and social, and including questions about preferences and values placed on children. A central theme is going to be the role of women and the way that society, as it's modernized over the past few hundred years, has changed the role of women dramatically. And then, in fact, much of the history of fertility decline and fertility going forward is going to be written exactly by women and their roles and essentially the way that society has treated women and given them more opportunity. But I want to talk about more than just women working. I want to talk about how women have changed the society in terms of the role of not only as voters in society for the social goods that they vote for, but also the support for children and also the desire to have careers and other choices than the traditional choices that women had 200 and 250 years ago. In order to do so and do it in a constructive way, we need to think about the role of the woman in a household, and we need to think about household decision-making more generally and the growth of the family. And here I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser about the growth, about the fertility model. Typically, when economists have addressed this question, and these are very distinguished economists who have addressed this question in the past, they have looked at the household as an entity. But one of the modern developments in economics has been the growth of an understanding of the household as consisting of individuals, and the issues of bargaining and the issues then of agreement and disagreement within the household as it affects the patterns of fertility that are evolving. And I keep emphasizing that this is an ongoing issue that we're talking about, and that many of the patterns that I'm talking about, which have been fully manufactured and fully developed and understood in some parts of the world, are undergoing transition and application in other parts of the world. And so I think as we understand the fundamental role of education, not only in changing the role of women, but changing the role of men and changing the way society is organized, we have to think deeply about an issue which in some sense may be even broader than that of fertility, and namely that we think about the great divide that's occurred politically, socially, economically, between the educated and the less educated. And I then want to consider the role of policy and the role of cultural diffusion, and considering how it is that as norms are changed, as new role models are tried and some rejected and some accepted, this has a profound effect on the way society has evolved. And so I will discuss each of these issues in a somewhat cursory manner. If you want a much more detailed vision, a version of these things, then you want to come tomorrow, or at least hear the proceedings of the conference. So let me just show you. Fertility decline is a fairly universal phenomenon. It's not universal, though, and I'll show you which way. Population growth rates are in decline in the world, generally so. So we put the whole world together, and we look at the patterns of the world population growth rate. We can see how in 1600 and over much of human history, even before, stationarity of the population or fluctuation around zero or very limited growth was essentially the norm. And then starting around the 1800s, we see a development that occurred. And that's associated with the development of the Industrial Revolution and changing the nature of the technology. And with it, the emerging role of skills and the importance of skill, and then the importance of education and producing skill, and then changing a whole way of life that had been traditional, not just for centuries, but for millennia. If you look at what the population fertility rate is today, you can see this graph here from the OECD analysis is showing you that the world population fertility rate is very different across different regions of the world. And so the fertility is highest today in Africa, essentially Central Africa, and in places like Mongolia and some parts of Afghanistan and so forth. But in generally, much of the developed world, developing world, even advanced developing world, we're seeing a decline in fertility. And a better way to think about it is to look at the fertility rates that put a society above replacement and below replacement. And so what we can see, for example, is that much of the world, not all of it, is below replacement, but some parts of the world are still above replacement. Almost all of Africa, except Tunisia, and parts of Central Asia are still above replacement. And in the Indonesian area, still above replacement. But even in China, certainly in China and in India, the population is going below replacement levels. So what that means is these populations are shrinking. And this changes, ultimately, the way that the societies will be organized. And the most dramatic way to look at this is just to look at a few of these plots. This is now by regions, just to show you that even though that graph that I showed you was contemporary, that the patterns have converged to more or less an area around 2. The replacement rate should roughly be 2.1 for there to be, the total fertility rate should be roughly 2.1 for there to be stability, stationarity in the population. And we can see that in parts of Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, their fertility rates have been below replacement and have been so for quite a while. And the trend has become very dramatic after the Second World War. And so this is, again, a fact that we need to carefully account for. And then this is more detail about individual countries. I apologize, I didn't put Hungary on the map. It wasn't my desire. I couldn't really find a good graph, so here it is. But you can see the general pattern of convergence. And this is an OECD-wide phenomena. So it would include countries like Korea. In fact, Korea is well below replacement. The replacement rate is around 0.7, 0.8. And we can see some very profound implications for Korea. That's been also true in China and in other countries, well, that aren't in the OECD. So let me then just give you some background in terms of economic theory and practice. And that is to understand how economic theory has changed. And this theory, economics sometimes gets criticized for not being that well equipped to deal with empirical reality. But in fact, Malthus was a very successful economic theorist. And the Malthusian theory was actually very successful for much of world history. And just to give an example, I mean, the idea of the Malthusian theory of somehow fertility and mortality would coexist in equilibrium. But the bottom figure here is showing that there is kind of a sense in which as the world gets richer, as productivity increases, and most of what Malthus was thinking about was land as a principal input, and then labor applied to land. Capital was not much of a factor throughout much of human history. What we see is an equilibrium level. If it rises to a sufficiently high level, if for some reason people get lucky, a new crop is found, or some demographic event occurs, then sometimes productivity of the soil will be sufficiently high that essentially there'll be a growth and a rise a level above a level of this so-called equilibrium replacement. But in fact, what happens then, and this is the Malthusian link, is if wealth improved or economy became more productive, then what happened was more babies were born, more mouths to feed, and eventually the income per capita fell down. And therefore, there was an equilibrium process, which is illustrated here in a traditional kind of demand-supply analysis. And this is just to remind you that if we look at the wages of wheat in sort of bushels over the year, that we see that the wages, look at the wage in ancient Babylonia and then look at the wage in England, centuries later, we can see that the per capita income, the classical Athens was sometimes the high point in this, and that's centuries ago. And so there's a lot of stability, in what we'd normally think of as a somewhat fluctuating environment. These kinds of statistics are no longer relevant, but they were highly relevant, and the reason why the Malthusian theory was so powerful. So one of the great exhibits in favor of Malthusian theory was an example of the daily wages in England over a period 1209 to 1869. And you'll notice wages went up, but why did they go up in that period? Because the plague reduced the population of England by about a third to a half. So there's a tremendous fall in the number of people, and therefore, if you look at a common economic proposition, looking at people relative to land, that basically there was a scarcity of people, the productivity of the remaining people rose, and they became wealthy. But then that was dissipated. And why? Because reproduction. The population expanded, and then eventually you can see by 1600, the advantage, if you want to call it that, of the plague had been eliminated. But you'll also see in this picture, starting around 1800, and this is a theme that comes throughout all of economic history, that from around the time of the Industrial Revolution, from about the time the society started organizing itself in a more productive way, that the wages started to rise. And that's a theme that actually defeated, in the long run, the Malthusian point of view. It wasn't just that supplies were limited, land was limited, and that somehow we were forced forever into this stable population. Something happened, and the question is what happened? And so the modern era is characterized by something called the demographic transition. And this is, again, going back to England, which is one of the best studied countries. That and Sweden have some of the longest data that we can go back to. In the English history, its historians have been very active and productive. But the demographic transition is essentially this transition showing essentially what the birth rate was in a given year. And then the birth rate in England started falling about 1880 or so, okay? And if you look below, you can see the red line is the death rate. And that started to decline as well. But you'll notice there's a bulge. The two lines are really falling, getting wider and wider during a period. And that's a period in which the birth rate is greater than the death rate and the population is exploding. And that's the demographic transition. And virtually all modern countries have gone through this demographic transition, but clearly at different times. So for example, if we take a look at Japan, the birth rate started falling around 1935 and fell to the level 1993. The death rate only really started falling after the Second World War, but then it fell dramatically. And then, of course, you had the demographic transition, but it was much shorter, and the period of transition much weaker. And in what this population distribution does, what the growth in the population does, this demographic transition, the imbalance between births and deaths, has a profound effect on the population distribution. And with it, all kinds of public policies that depend on the shift of individuals between payments, say between the more advanced, the elder people, the parents and the children, and the parents of the parents who become then maybe the wards of the state through population redistribution policy. So for example, if you look at South Korea, we can see a very imbalanced age pyramid. And this is a consequence then of this very diminished fertility. It's the lowest in the world, one of the lowest in the world. There's some debate about who's lowest. And then you can see also that on the left-hand side, you'll see a surplus of males in the early year, and that was partly caused by the introduction of amniocentesis and sex preference in Korea. And you can also see the increase in the number of females at the oldest age, the relative increase, and that again is just due to biology and lifestyle practices. But you can also see how narrow the pyramid is now. That if you think of the lower part of that pyramid supporting the older part of the pyramid in the traditional Confucian society, it becomes a real tax on society. And that kind of policy is also found. China went through the one-child policy. It experienced tremendous amount of restriction in the growth, but there's an older population now, aging then into retirement that needs support. And that then changes the nature of the fiscal policy. So these are very recent developments, but they're actually, of course, the USA is similar, not to Korea, but there definitely still is declining fertility in the US, not as drastic as in Korea. And again, the same factor about promotion of more women living in older ages. Here's a nice contrast, though. This is Chad. This is one of the countries that shows dramatic growth rate in fertility, huge, above replacement. And so you get a huge young cohort and a relatively small older cohort. And so if Chad really had a well-developed social welfare system, there'd be no problem financing it. Unfortunately, it doesn't have one, but that's not the problem here about the problem of Chad. So this shows you the thing. And so what's happening now, these trends are very, very important. And the trends are very important in how societies evolve, how society, constructs itself. And we can also see trends that I think are tied more closely to higher levels of education and this growth of skill that really was a novelty in the world of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, at one point, even in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, somebody like Henry Ford would say, it's unfortunate that my workers have a pair of hands, but also a brain. They really wanted to separate. There was a period in which we used unskilled labor, and it was a very valuable resource. But what we can see, though, is that now we do have the brain, and the brain is more and more valued. And that's as a consequence of the process of technical change and the education that grew out of the Industrial Revolution. It's a very complex process I'm describing. But a consequence of all this has been this pattern, again, taken from some OECD data, just OECD data. But if you look, you can see the total fertility rate is going down. Okay, it's not a perfect measure. And some of the discussions tomorrow will really talk about how imperfect it really is, because it doesn't really capture cohort change that well. But nonetheless, it's a measure that's widely used. But if you're looking now what's going on, the age of childbirth has changed tremendously. And the age at first birth has changed tremendously. And part of that surely has to do with education and has to do with the fact that the life expectancy has actually gone up tremendously too. So the life cycle that was maybe 30 or 40 years in England in 250 years ago now is 70, 80 years old in some parts of the world. And so you'll see a tremendous growth. And so there's a lot of planning, a lot of delay. And so the onset of fertility is later, the onset of, and the mean age of fertility. So that's fertility decline in all countries. Just to emphasize the point, we can stare at this, but we can see the black line is the replacement rate. The blue lines are the current levels, as current as I can get. And you can see, again, Hungary got itself on the map now, so don't feel I'm oppressing you somehow. But you can see that Hungary was already one of the countries below replacement some years ago. In fact, Andorka, who is a famous demographer here and famous in his connection with the university, Corvinus University, discussed this very thoroughly. And in some sense, the conference tomorrow is building what Andorka discussed, not only in terms of the facts, but also in terms of the implications for social policy. But if you look at the difference between 1980, 2000, and 2020, you can see an acceleration in the trend and reduction then in the fertility rate. And what's also going, and what was surprising for many people, is that childlessness measured in a life cycle sense. So what's looking at is ages, women at 40 years of age or older, looking at those cohorts, these different birth cohorts, finding out how many are childless. And so we can see that if we look at some of the countries, some of the most advanced countries on the top, the childlessness rates are close to 25%, which means, again, a part of this is that many women are simply not either getting married at all, or if they're getting married, not having children. And this is, again, an aspect of this whole notion of postponement of the mean age of fertility. It contributes to this. And so it's definitely an increase in childlessness, and it's not just in the countries I displayed earlier, but it's certainly true in many countries like Bulgaria, Portugal, but certainly in Japan, it's the highest level. And in other countries as well, you can see, in Spain and so forth. So there really is a change in the nature of the family and the nature of what was considered a typical life cycle in the life of children. So what are the explanations? And this is something we're going to discuss. Why did this happen? So there was a traditional explanation, and Matthias Dürpke has written a nice paper with Michel Turtelt discussing this, and he'll discuss these papers much more thoroughly tomorrow. But just to summarize briefly, the Malthusian model was refuted. That what happened starting in the 1950s, 60s, and so forth, we started to notice that as fertility went down, as income went up. And so this was contrary to the idea that there was a positive relationship. The children were what economists call a normal good, what you want. And there were different theories advanced, all within the same general rubric. Duesenberry, as a famous economist who was at Harvard in 1960, discussed a paper of Becker. And he postulated the idea that essentially then, as the family income went up, it was unlikely that people who were parents would treat their children any differently than themselves. So which made everything 3 times, if you had 2 children, then you had essentially like 4 adults. Maybe there was a shaving back, but you were spending more money because your children would share your standard of living. So the example that he gave would be, it's unlikely that the parents would be eating steak and caviar and the children were sent to the back eating, peanut butter sandwiches or even worse. And so literally, the question is, it became costly to have children because of several factors. And Becker and Lewis formalized this in a somewhat different model. Oh, yeah, good, thank you, I'm drying out here. Very good. So then what we saw that world incomes were going up post-1850, but with it then, the total fertility rates were going down. Not all at the same rate, and not all uniformly. You can see there's a period like the baby boom in the US, and there were baby booms in other countries as well. But what we see is then a pattern of fertility decline. And this relationship was generally true in 1970. So if you just look at the figures up there, you can sort of piece out which countries are there. The higher income countries, a cluster on the right-hand side, were much more likely to have low total fertility rates, whereas the low-income countries had high fertility rates. And that was a source of great concern in the late 1960s and 70s, that world population growth was in fact a serious problem, viewed to be a serious problem. So what was one of the reasons for the decline of fertility? Well, one crucial factor, and I think it's one of the most important factors that doesn't receive enough attention, is that schooling increased. Schooling became much more prevalent for several reasons. One, there was a notion that public education was demanded. In fact, these kinds of public goods became more accepted in many societies as more women actively participated in the society. There's no denying that. If you look, for example, at societies where women have had the vote and haven't had the vote, the level of expenditure on education is generally much higher when women have been able to vote. So there's a certain change within the democratic welfare states. And education is a measure of quality of the child. So there's a demand for both men and women for quality children. But there's also another notion of education. Education changes the opportunity cost of mother's time. So as the mother becomes more educated, she has better earnings potential, and it's costly to raise children. We all know that. We have children. And mothers bear a tremendous amount of the cost of the child. And so the schooling increase had this kind of multiple effect. It kind of made children more costly, if you want to think about it. If you think that the quality of children became a norm, and you wanted more education. And then secondly, the opportunity cost of women's time rose, so it was more costly then for fertility decline when women were actually getting higher wages. And that happened in many of these societies where income was going up. But I think what we need to understand, and this is something that Durkee and Tertilt and others have pointed out, many leading demographers as well, that a link between educational attainment and fertility has changed in recent periods. And this is something that's extremely important. So what we see, and maybe this isn't the best picture, is a link between labor market outcomes and fertility. I'll skip past that. But the new pattern in the 1990s has been a reversal of this pattern. The reversal of the pattern, which was considered to be the major issue in economic demography in the 1980s and 1990s. The number of dissertations written on this notion of quantity-quality trade-off or Duesenberry effects or whatever you want to call them is enormous. But nonetheless, it changed. And so what happened is something that's very, very interesting. That literally, if you look at the graph on the left, that's the kind of graph I was showing you earlier, period. That's a graph looking at the total fertility rate graphed against the GDP per capita. And you can see that, again, you're getting that the high-income countries had lower fertility rates. Now look at the change in the graph as it goes up in the later period. Just 20 years later, that graph switches. So the relationship now becomes, in those countries with a higher level of GDP, that was associated with a higher level of total fertility. So the pattern reversed. And in fact, this pattern graphs the reversal of the pattern that occurred around 1990 overall. So if you look at these countries. So what you see now is the richer countries are having higher total fertility rates. And it's not just the richer countries, it's the richer regions of countries are having higher fertility rates. And so we can see then, there used to be this notion that the higher the labor force participation of women, the lower the fertility. Well, it reversed itself in this period, as you can see from this graph, that this relationship changed fundamentally. And what we've also seen is something pretty remarkable, but you'll notice how specialized it is. And this is taking me to a second point, or to another point about the nature of education. You can see that the fertility has increased, but especially for the highly educated women. What used to be the least fertile, if you will, having the lowest fertility rates, have moved up. You go from like 1980 to 2019, from the black dot at the bottom above, you can see that the higher postgraduate college, rates have actually gone up tremendously and breaking the pattern. It's not just true in the United States, it's true in most countries. Not so dominant in Spain, but certainly true in Germany and France, and not so much in Italy. But this pattern has generally been found. So this leads to the question of a deeper understanding of family life and the changing role of women. And here, I want to just point out something that's usually not discussed together with fertility. Namely, the earnings of women are rising. That's as a consequence of the level of education. There's also some role, education rising, the opportunity cost rising. And all kinds of restrictions that were placed on women working in the market have been reduced. So in some sense, earnings are rising. But another phenomenon is happening in Western societies and many societies, and that is the process of assortative mating, that highly educated men are marrying highly educated women. And so inside those households, what you're finding is increasingly households are more likely, very highly educated individuals, males say, are being more likely to be associated with higher educated wives. As a group, they have more income, much higher income. But there's even more to say about that in a second. I'll show you what there is to say. But this gives you an example of data from England, and this is typical of what goes on in Western Europe, that we can see the correlation in earnings across husband and wives has gone up a lot. And this is as a result of the increase in education of women and the opportunity cost. And what we can also see now, and this is very important, and this is my only, Hawking once said, for each equation you put on, you lose half your audience. So we block the exits, so you have to stay. But let me just explain this, because this is the only equation I'm really putting up. But it really gets at a central point, which is what I want to make, and then I'll quit talking, I'll just amplify the point. But literally, many people thought about these models, economic models, of a single household. And we thought about the model as being completely what's called a unitary model, a single decision maker, maybe a husband, maybe a wife, usually a husband making rules, the wife obeying, and so forth. This model that's been developed in the recent times, and it's very heavily developed, highly developed in recent work, represented here at this conference as well, is what we're seeing is a model in which a household model is a weighted average. The preferences are in some sense weighted average of women's preferences for goods. So C and L are consumption, leisure. CP is fertility, is what we can think of as a public good, but it could also, we can think of fertility as a primary public good. It's a good that's consumed by both husband and wife. What we also see is that males consume their own consumption of whatever goods are, their own leisure, but the public good is shared in common. And then crucially, if you look at the equation on top, there are gammas, and these are weights, so-called Pareto weights, that put the weight, the utility associated with the female and with the male. And so the rest is just a budget constraint, saying that resources have to add up, we have to pay for the goods and so forth. But this gamma plays a very important role, and it represents the wife's relative bargaining power. And I want to argue that this gamma has gone up, and it has huge implications, not only for fertility, but also for household income inequality. So just give you an example, it's a great paper by Jeremy Leese and Shannon Seitz, published some 10 years ago, just to show you how important it is to really understand allocations within the household, not just allocations across households, as was traditionally done. So they were looking at the variance in log consumption, in Britain over the period 1970 to 2000. And you can see the variance, went up a little, went down, then it went back up, but it's hovering around the same general position. But you'll notice the bottom, and this is where the interesting stature occurs, that if you look at the inequality between households, that actually went up. That's the process of assortative mating. As more households get more married couples with high level of education, for the man and the wife, their earning power went up. And then, within the household, because of the higher bargaining power that women had in the market, as a result of improved market wages, the share of the total goods consumed and the whole decision-making power changed greatly within the household. So that's a dimension which we need to look at. And it can help explain some things where you're looking at things, well, these are desired fertility, desired by whom, and desired why, and why might there be some gap between desired utility and a desired number of children and the number of the actual children that proceed. It could be the way the sharing rules are working out. If you think that women, and this is one of the major findings in modern development economics, has been if you give a woman more money in an experiment, say in Africa, and you ask how she spends the money, as opposed to giving it to the man, the woman is much more likely to spend it on child goods and child development, has much greater utility for child welfare. And you can see that in the sense of saying, well, what this means is that the opportunity costs for women rose. In the same time, these households had a greater share, a greater total total pie that came because of the assortative mating, the husband and the wife both working. But what it ended up with was essentially then more bargaining power for the woman, and the woman's preferences played a much stronger role. And that's essential, and you can see this. I'll give you some examples from some, so women's share of bargaining rose. That's my only mathematics, so if you want to leave, you wasted your chance. But there's some recent work by Lundberg and Pollack that extends some work that's been developed by Becker, my colleague, my deceased colleague, and unfortunately deceased, and others. But a deeper understanding as a model of household bargaining. And so what you can see then, and this is some work that Durkee has shown in his recent work, but what you can see then is that the average share of work done by the men and the fertility, the disagreement between how many kids the man wants and how many times the woman wants, how many kids the woman wants, you'll see there's a gap between the two. And that gap depends critically on the amount of household childcare done by men, and in a similar way, the more labor force participation is, the higher the labor force participation gap, the lower the fertility, the wider the disagreement. And so what we're seeing is that as men's share of work actually increases, just look at the graph on the right, that the total fertility rate actually tends to rise. This is again a consequence of bargaining within the household, and the fact that women play a much more dominant role than they did in shaping their values. So there's no contradiction, for example, for women wanting fewer children than men, and that's a persistent finding. But literally realizing more children still as a result of getting greater share of income, so that their shares can rise, and that could even account for the increase in total fertility. So there may be disagreement between the man and the woman may not agree with the man, but they both may be constrained. And as the woman gets more resources, the constraint gets relaxed. And so you're moving towards the ideal fertility that the woman expresses. So what's happened is a trend, this is a trend from British data, but it's true in American data as well, that the wife's share of full income and consumption has increased. This is the distribution of these two different factors in 70 and in 2000. So women's power has definitely increased. And we can also see, and again, as the societies become more, let's say, child-oriented in consumption and so forth, spending as a percent of GDP, the fertility rate increases. So in a lot of the Nordic welfare states are either at or just below replacement. And that's because of the massive expenditure that includes on things like childcare, payments, and so forth. And so literally what we see then at the same time, and this is a cohort phenomenon. That's why the idea of taking a stationary cohort, very standard practice in the education and the economic analysis, is somewhat misguided, because in younger cases, we can see, first of all, men with higher education are playing a bigger role in childcare. They're not playing the same role as women, still not. But it's growing, and it's grown a lot over time. And we can see, for example, the parental child care over time. The father's role still diminished relative to the mother's role, both increasing. In fact, one of the most interesting findings came from some work by a demographer named Bianchi, who's now deceased, unfortunately, who pointed out that the most educated women were also spending the most time in the home, taking care of the children. And it came out of their leisure time. So they literally had much less time and leisure, but they were carefully devoted to the education and cultivation of their children. But fathers have moved in the same direction. And so there really is a role here. But here you can see where society is splitting between the highly educated and the less educated. And you can see that even in voting patterns in many parts of the country. Certainly in my own country in the most recent elections, you can see very sharp educational differentials in voting patterns. So let me just conclude by talking about what factors lead to postponement of fertility. Well, I've already said the age of first birth has gone up. This gives you a little more dramatic difference, but it's quite different. That could be due to postponed marriages or postponed cohabitations. There's been a growth in cohabitation, although that's a controversial dimension, because in the US, cohabitation generally has a much less savory criterion. It has much worse consequences for children than the same kind of measure of cohabitation in Nordic countries, where it's a more stable relationship and there's a lot of positive sorting. In the US, some of the cohabitations can have as many as 11 members in a cohabitation within the course of 1 year. So there's a high degree of turnover. But putting that to the side, the fact of the matter is the average age of birth, many factors, postponement of marriage, and then the delay of marriage. And part of it also has to do with the structure of the fact that as women gain career concerns and as they become more engaged with their own long-term career, they have an incentive. Because one of the major findings in economics has been the growth in wages that come with the length of time. So if a woman wants to become a member of a law school, of a law partnership, or develop a career, those kinds of career concerns cause her to delay the onset of marriage, certainly the delay onset of childbearing. And that essentially then slows everything down. And that also has consequences for fertility, because if fertility is declining with age of women, as it is, then that by itself is a force towards reducing population growth. There's also another aspect, that there's growing pessimism and uncertainty about the children's future. So many countries now show, a growing number of countries, some 20, not all, but most, showing that essentially they think that children will miss out on the progress. Their children will not do as well as themselves. And there is a link between policy and general costs and outcomes. And Dorka talked about this in his own work on this topic. But we also can see that, again, if you look at housing costs and so forth, that you can see that if you think about one housing arrangement, that's a consequence of high housing costs, the share of young adults living with their parents. And that's increased tremendously. So look at the share in Korea. It's enormous. You're a Korean, so he can verify whether I'm telling the truth. I like that. And it's not so substantial in Denmark, where the housing policy has been very generous, for example. But so that's one aspect. And so you think, well, if a couple they want to have a couple, it's difficult if you're living with your parents. You may not even get married. In Italy, it's really a pronounced problem. It's, there's a story, the one description of the Italian case was too much family and too little children. And it's true. The Italian case is really quite low. And let me just conclude. So we're living in a world with rapid change. And this is the part that's really important to understand. You know, a lot of standard economic tools deal with kind of long-term, infinite horizons or long-term environments. But in fact, there's a dynamism here that we really need to capture in our own research on this question. And there's been a changing role in the media and a changing role about what women should be doing. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion. If you look at the feminism of the 1950s, 60s by people like Betty Friedan, there was a general tone that, and you still see it in the literature, you still see it in the campaigns, that the 1950s woman, the 1960s woman, the housewife, was kind of living in a world where she was going crazy and had no opportunity. She had to babble to the child, a good education was being wasted. And then there are various versions of feminism that have spread, but there's generally been a notion that the opportunity for women should increase, and that a modern household has a working woman and has a woman who then is not only a partner to her husband as in traditional family life, but also as an independent role, and for a variety of reasons, has a role in the household. And so one of the nicest examples we're going to see an example of tomorrow is by a study by Ferrara, who's at this conference. And she did a study, and this sounds really superficial, but it actually is very interesting. There's a soap opera in Brazil that was introduced in the 1960s or so. Now this soap opera gave a modern notion of what the role of women should be. And it was introduced into very traditional areas of Brazil and then introduced in other areas. The interesting thing is the rollout of television in Brazil was kind of staggered. There were some areas that did receive, some did not. It wasn't so obviously linked to the income of those districts. So, of course, Rio and Sao Paulo got television right away. But the interior of Brazil, some of the parts here to the west, did not receive television until very late. And you can see almost a perfect track of how fertility declined as this kind of modern vision of women increased. This is the role of media. It's the role of actually setting norms. And there's a real question of whether those norms, how they're created, how they're diffused, and so forth. But literally, if you look at, this is the graph from her study, it shows that what the fertility decline was from the time of introduction of the television program into the region in Brazil. And you can see the fertility drops a lot, and it's statistically significant drop. And so what you're getting then is that essentially just this exposure to new ideas and new models led to some discussions, let's put it that way. Never mind the growth of the education of women in Brazil and the other opportunities available to them. So I think when we think about fertility, we have to think very broadly about how norms are defined, how they're percolated through society, and how the share of women, the role of women has changed and is changing. And it's a constant. It's not a constant role. There's a lot of redefinition and rediscussion. But we need to take this into account in developing a richer model of fertility. So if you want to hear more about this, come tomorrow, although you may want to kill me because the room isn't that big. But I think this represents a really exciting problem in studying social change. We've gone through a dramatic change in the way we think about having babies, about having society, and the role of women in that society. And it's clear that different cohorts within a society have very different values and very different expectations. And studying those in a very systematic way will prove to be very fertile. And I hope Corvinus will stand out as a world leader in understanding this study. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for the honor you conferred on me.
Thank you very much, Professor Heckman, for this excellent lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests, now we have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments regarding the presentation. Please wait for the microphone brought by our colleagues. So please raise your hands and our colleagues will bring your microphone if you would like to ask a question. And first.
I want to rescind the degree.
Can I begin?
Sure.
Can I begin?
Oh, I guess I need one.
Talking to him.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Eva Berde, and I am so grateful to have the opportunity to be here and listen to your excellent presentation. And I am also very grateful that you provided on net this webinar. There are 8 webinars. Unfortunately, I had time only to listen to 5 of them. But I have 4 remarks, and one of my remark refers to that presentation. My first remark, because you here and in the presentation as well, you spoke a lot about postponement of childbearing and the new ideas in connection with this. And I just want to pay your attention that a special branch of literature deals with this. So I pay your attention, for example, Professor Sobotka. He said me, it's over now, unfortunately, because postponement followed by recuperation, so that was good. But now it's over because it reached the biological end.
He'll be here tomorrow, so important part of the conference.
My second remark, thank you very much for the last thought, that I agree that the decision is in the hand of women.
Yes.
and it must be paid into consideration, and we must speak about the opportunity of contraception, what contraception provides. And it is true in the last part of the world as well. So we must pay attention. And you mentioned Malthus, but you did not continue this thought. And I think Malthus was right. Just a little mistake, that because he saw that there is a shortage of land and natural resources, and I think after the contraception, there is a shortage. Women can find that there is a shortage of their energy and their opportunity, and they can decide. So if the world increases their opportunity, I am sure that fertility will increase. And my last remark regards the reverse of fertility rate in rich country in 2010. You said in last years, after 2000. But we analyzed this fact with one of my PhD students, and it turned out that is it not true anymore. It was true in 2010 at the beginning, but in nowadays there is no reversal. Even in rich countries, the total fertility rate decreased, we found. So that's all, and thank you.
Is that just a Hungarian phenomenon, or is that true more widely? That's interesting.
It is only our calculation.
Yeah, no, I think,
but look at Sweden,
no, I definitely
Denmark,
want to see that.
France,
That's important.
very, very low total
Yeah.
fertility rate.
No, you think so, but the only point is that more educated women now command greater resources. They have a greater share, and they're also living together with spouses. And I think there really is a change, maybe slow, but the role of men in the household, younger men in particular, playing a much more predominant role than in traditional society.
Educated women have a slightly higher total fertility
Right.
rate than before, but it's not true that richer countries have higher fertility.
Okay, now it'd be interesting to see the reversal. Okay, so that's not inconsistent though, but for sure. Because I think it's more important, like you're saying, to disaggregate by the education and by the various social and economic classes within a country, because those will change as countries develop. So yeah, I agree. But wait, you had 4 questions. You want me to, or you have more questions?
No, this was 4 question and remark.
Okay.
And again,
so,
thank you very much. It was very interesting.
well, no, but I don't want to short Malthus. I mean, definitely you can keep the Malthusian model, but you just have to modify it by saying that post, say, 1750 or so, there was something called the Industrial Revolution. And then we had capital coming in, things like the steam engine, we had things like locomotives, we had various kinds of technology that boosted the productivity of land, and various kinds of discoveries. For example, fertilizers, various kinds of technological innovations in agriculture. But then in the end, also the boost in human capital. So there was a consequence, I think, of the Industrial Revolution, because skill became very important in a way that it wasn't. I mean, skill was always important. When monks were, copying manuscripts in the 8th century, no question that you had to be skilled to do that, and very few people had those skills. So what happened with the Industrial Revolution, the invention of printing and the invention more of universal literacy, and then the invention of ideas that could spread, diffuse. And then on top of that, then the demand for people who could help propel the increase in the rate at which technology accelerated. And that's ultimately what more educated people do. So getting people involved in a way that was more active in the sense of changing the productivity. So Malthus was right, except he underestimated the power of technical change and human capital. You have
but there is still shortage of the energy of women, and this is something very similar.
Well, I don't know. At least the women I know don't seem to be short of energy, but no, I mean, they're more educated, they're living longer lives, they have more opportunities. I think if anything, it may be they don't want to choose this. That's a different proposition. But I don't know if it's a restriction on their energy. I think if anything, the energy of all of us has gone up, right? I mean, in 1750, the number of people who were over 50 was very small in most countries. There were some, but not many. And just the whole life expectancy has increased. And with it then, the return to investment and the whole amount of activity. So that's a form of energy. And don't forget the growth in health standards. I went over quickly the demographic transition. But a crucial reduction in the birth rate, the death rate, was essentially the introduction of public health. And that only became available around the beginning of the in the middle of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, you started getting that. But it really comes into full play only late in the 19th century. So I think that was really a major factor towards, producing. Because remember, the number of think of the child mortality rate in the 1750. That's gone in most countries. There are some countries where it's not so good. But in those countries, you can actually see the burden of pregnancy. I mean, how many children would you have to get one to survive? You'd have 7 or 8 or 9 children, and now it's not that required at all. 2 children will generally survive. Maybe one will die. But the whole childbearing process has become much safer and much better. So the demand on the women is lower. It's still a demand. It's still a huge job, but it's still not as terrifying as it was, I think. I mean, don't forget it was in the 19th century. It was only then, it was only late in the middle of the 20th century that the life expectancy of women started to outpost that of men because of childbirth, child pregnancy problems. All those deaths were eliminated by modern medical practice. So I would say the women's energies are pretty big. But the other part that's going is the scope of their activity, their willingness. And I mean, think of the role of the traditional woman in the new Afghanistan and take it with some of the role of traditional woman in Hungary. I think there's quite a bit of difference in those two, and most Western countries as well. So, and I think that gives them I don't know if it's a reduction of energy, it's like an expansion of opportunities. And I think we need to understand it better. So I'm all on board. So tell me more, and I'll be happy to listen.
Thank you so much. 3 small questions. The first one, with highly educated women and men in the couple, you say there is an increase yes, when they are sorted. But is it going beyond the 2.1 threshold? Because it seems marginal.
No, these are forces moving in that direction. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I wanted water. It's forces moving in that direction, but they haven't. No, none of those. But what you will see if you look closely at those graphs, and they're public knowledge, so you can take them. They're in the public domain. Is you'll see that in many cases the total fertility rate is getting close to 2. Like in France, it's getting very close to 2. And in some of the countries in Northern Europe, like Denmark and in Sweden, what you're getting is a very high level of support. So for childcare and so, and the role of men in those societies is actually increased compared to those in more traditional societies.
Yeah, so if I may, that was exactly the question I had. What are the countries which have social policies or social support that actually lead to a successful, much higher birth rate? And second, by transitivity, we saw the link to television. Should we worry about the impact of smartphone?
Of social media?
Look at the young generation. They're completely locked into their smartphone. Should we worry about the impact of that?
Well, it certainly will have an effect. I don't think it's been studied yet. We're going to see it unfold. I mean, certainly we've seen studies that suggest that children, this is a little off topic, but children who are living their daily lives on social media are learning at a lower rate. And we do see that as a negative, no question about it. And leading also to more isolation. So, and that the greater the isolation, I don't know if that's pro-fertility or anti-fertility. My guess is it's anti-fertility in some sense. If you live your life all on the social media, I mean, the worst case is, I don't know if you read this, saw this movie about a man who fell in love with his operating system. You laugh, but there are companies that are making artificial partners. And if that goes on too far, and there really are replacements. Somebody raised the question, well, could, maybe with artificial intelligence getting more active, maybe that could replace a dearth of births. Maybe and maybe not, because the difference, I think, is that with artificial intelligence maybe replacing the smaller number of bodies in society, you could replace the number of bodies with human capital. So you can have higher human capital stocks even with a lower birth rate, no question about it. That's changing education. But AI is not going to do it for you in the sense of getting the same participation of parents in producing the AI. With children, there's a certain altruism. I don't know if many people would be altruistic towards their AI, but maybe they would. So there are different factors. But I do think the social media is another aspect. And the whole issue of how norms are settled is not that clear. I did interact with Betty Friedan for a little while when I was at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford some years ago. And she was very adamant in her books and writings that the traditional female role of the 1950s and 1960s was deadening and was basically just destroying women's minds. And what that meant was, I think that did have a harmful effect on marriage. Harmful is the wrong word. It had reduced participation in marriage and created kind of an antagonism towards the traditional family. As far as I can see, the things are reversing a bit, quite a bit actually, and people are looking for a more moderate course. It isn't just kind of notion of abstinence or some hostility. But I think this is something to be studied, and we'll hear more about.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent lecture. I'm actually going to use it in my teaching in a month. You didn't, though, talk about another aspect of the opportunity cost of child rearing, which is the provision of daycare services. And I was just wondering, about your opinion on the impact of the widespread, either private or public availability of daycare, early childcare, and how that might actually interact with these very interesting heterogeneous patterns that you've talked about. I had my personal experience in the US with a young kid, and there you definitely needed a two-person professional household to afford daycare. But in European countries it's different, so yeah.
In Nordic countries, for example, in Denmark and Norway and Sweden in particular, there's a large subsidy given to childcare, and like the time off required, given for both the husband and the wife in that situation, substantial. And you can see, in just a pure correlational sense, a greater total fertility rate in those countries. And you can also see a greater sharing of work in the household, certainly in Denmark, in terms of time spent. So that's suggestive. It doesn't say it caused it. See, this is a kind of question where I think you have to be very careful. I worry about just running simple correlations and say, oh, here, Denmark did this, ergo. Why did Denmark do this? Because Denmark has women voting, and women vote on these matters that they care about, including childcare. And so if they have a say, there will be women working will want more childcare. So it's a political economy question as well as maybe a causality question. And that hasn't been sorted out yet. The only thing I know is that there's one study, which probably many of you are familiar with, that occurred on studying social welfare expenditure in Switzerland some years ago. Remember, at one point, some of the cantons in Switzerland only let men vote. Those are the German-speaking ones. The ones in the French-speaking cantons, women could vote. And there was a comparison made. At one point, women couldn't vote in either. But once women got the vote in the French-speaking cantons, the expenditure on social welfare increased. And it didn't in the German-speaking. So that's really an express preference. And if you look over the centuries about which group of people has been most concerned about children, childcare, and so forth, it's women. So I think there's going to be an equilibrium to be determined about how. It's not much in the literature. Maybe somebody knows something I don't know. But there's a really interesting political economy question. As women get the vote, as women get more participation, they can then ask that more of the public goods be spent on things that make their lives more pleasant. And so that's That is, but there is a correlation along the lines. And in the American situation, childcare is very disastrous. It's very expensive. You're getting groups of people, you suffered it yourself. But it's even worse for a lot of these single parents, less educated, earning near the minimum wage. The amount of money they have to spend, they'll usually go into private markets on daycare. And those are very poorly regulated, low quality, and it's considerably dangerous in some sense to put children in those environments. But that's the only thing they can do. I heard an even worse situation. I know that in Brazil, many years ago, I was in Brazil when this happened, that a child had been killed by the following procedure. The mother had no child care, and the only way that she was able to watch after her child was to put a string around the child's body or something. And the child ended up strangling himself. And it was, that was an extreme example. But there really is a sense that these very poor daycare centers can be harmful. And that's even true of public provision. Studies in Montreal and others have shown that if you really give free child care, but it's at very low quality, it has substantially adverse effects on child development, especially for the boys. And what's most interesting that's been found is that in the study in Canada, the Montreal study, the boys who were most affected were the sons of very well-educated mothers. So they put their kids into these mediocre childcare homes. The kids themselves were adversely affected, but of course the mother was freed to do more work. So there's a real trade-off in that regard in public policy. And it's just a political economy question as to how much you want to spend on these matters. But it's getting to be more and more of an issue, women's voting issues. In the U.S., it's more or less become, in the last election, whether women were most pronounced in their political say was on the abortion issue. But I think as we go forward, the other issue about provision of child care, that's a major issue. And that's one that affects everybody. Because I think abortion gets to be accepted universally, I think. Anyway, that's a prognostication. I don't know that for true.
Dr. Heckman, I'm Dr. Hong-Dok, ambassador from South Korea. Congratulations once again for receiving the honorary doctoral degree from the most distinguished university in Hungary, and then also thank you very much for outstanding the lecture. And then the question is that in Korea, as you just said that this is most serious problem and challenge for us. The problem is we spend about billions dollars to try to fix this question, the problem, but nothing. We don't really solve this problem. So my suggestion is that when you had a joint commission with the Korean University, if you allow me, that I'm going to send one of the Korean the fellow or the research the researchers to join your program, and then I'll be very much appreciated. Also if you can give us some some advice. So where do we go from here? Because we spend every possible ways, but we cannot unfortunately turn the direction away from the serious problems.
Well, first of all, in Korea, there's a very interesting recent paper that gets to the question of social norms by, I think it's by Michelle Turtelt, right? One of the papers she mentioned. And what she did a study of the decline in Korea. And she found that it was social pressure that actually was a major factor in reducing the fertility. Because given the norm that all children would go to college and that there were these high levels of investment, and then on top of that, this whole question of spending money on children outside of school, right? What is it called? What's that?
Academy, the private academy outside.
The private academic instruction, but there's a name. Hagwon.
Yeah, Hagwon. Yeah.
Hagwon, right. So Hagwon is very expensive, and that's something that's become very stratified. For more educated women, they can pay that. But for less educated women, it gets very costly. But if you're in a race, essentially, you want your kids to be as good as everybody else, but you don't have the money to do it. So they say it's better not to have a kid than to have a low-quality kid. And so she documents that that's a factor in life. So how these norms, that seems a little excessive, you know, and maybe not every child should go to college. And I mean, the college going rate in Korea is enormous, right? Like 70, 80% of everybody goes to college, but then there are different kinds of colleges. And so, you know, there's still a degree quality issue. So I think that's a very important question, this idea of how these social preferences are shaped. But Korea is one of the most stressed countries in the world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really, it seems to be a lot of life stress on working women. And a lot of women are working in Korea, right?
Almost half of the women graduate from the college, they got married.
Right, smaller.
They're small.
So there is a question of traditional challenge. Now, I know that some people would say, let's go back. There's always a notion of go back. And I'm not saying we shouldn't go back. There could be a revival, always go back, maybe. But I think the question might be more constructive to say, where do we go forward? And we just say, well, how might society adjust? And then there's a deeper question, which I never even addressed. You should have asked me. And that is, who cares? What if the world is smaller? I mean, if we have, remember, 1970s, people were writing about the population boom. The world is going to be exploding with people. That was the whole problem. And now suddenly we're talking about the population bust. But who cares? If you have a highly educated population, but there does seem to be some thinking. There's some economists who presented the idea that the smaller, the older the population, the less dynamic it is, and the less creative it is. And that means the less likely to take chances and less likely to engage in the entrepreneurial risk that make a society dynamic. And that's not just in industrial processes, but in ideas, scholarship, and so forth and so on. So many people see an aging society as a less vital society. So maybe there's a way to make old people more vital. That would be the way to go, I think, personally. But
Thank you.